This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, written or unwritten, to the thought, concrete or abstract, and to debate of all types and purposes. I am your host, Gilad Halpern. Thank you very much for joining me. And on our program today, our first guest will be Dr. Elad Segev of the Department of Communications at the Tel Aviv University, who will talk to us about his recent studies that have sought to establish whether Israel is really unfairly singled out in the Western media. And the results, not surprisingly, are more ambiguous than you might think. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, good morning.
We are here to discuss the attitude of the Western media towards Israel and Palestine, and this is basically a twofold discussion, because on the one hand, there's the notion of media attention at large, whether keywords related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and other related issues do appear disproportionately in the Western media, and on the other hand, whether these references are predominantly positive or negative. And this is a twofold discussion where both parts are somewhat interrelated. So let's start at the beginning. It is often claimed that Israel is singled out in the public debate in Europe and North America, in which the media, of course, play a significant role. And you, as the good social scientist that you are, have developed a model that's supposed to measure and quantify that. So tell us a bit about it. And, you know, the bottom line is whether this assertion is true. Is Israel really singled out?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to explain a little bit better about what is this tool about. We developed together with Professor Menachem Blondheim from the Hebrew University a model that capture the news from various different sources around the world, from 13 different countries and almost 40 different sources including also sources that are news aggregator, what we call that's the Google News, that in itself contains like thousands of different sources.
Mm-hmm. And it has also an editorial slant.
Exactly.
Right? Mm-hmm.
It's an aggregator that has they claim not a human editorial slant, but rather an algorithm that choose which news to take, which not.
But it's not random, that's the point, right?
No, it's not random. And we try to capture as much as possible of the what kind of countries appear in the news around the world, and as you said, in what is the keywords related to those countries.
Mm-hmm.
And in this particular talk, I would present the case of Israel, where we did find that there is a lot of mention of Israel. It's disproportionate to its size or its economic power. If there are theoretical models why countries appear on the news, so Israel doesn't come with those models because we're small.
And also as opposed to other countries where conflicts are raging, because, you know, this is really why so much attention is directed at us. Right.
So there are several explanations why countries appear in the news. One is the size and the power, and the second is if it engaged in conflicts around the world. And third is how much this country is relevant to the country that report. If it has a border with that country, if it has trade connections. But still, if you take all those variables into account, you see that Israel outperforms and appears much more. It is usually the top 5 or the top 10 countries around the world, mainly in German news, and Arabic news, of course, in the Middle East, Egyptian, and they mention us more than other foreign countries. and the States and UK. It's interesting because you can trace back and see that there are historical roots.
Yeah. Well, the Arab world, for obvious reasons, so is Germany. But how do you explain the difference between other Western countries, other European countries? Why is it more apparent in the British media as opposed to other places in continental Europe?
It is more apparent in German news and in French news. Less in British news, but comparing to Asian countries, it's much more because of I think the historical involvement. I would like to, if I may, touch the other aspect that you mentioned that. We also asked in what context Israel is mentioned.
We'll get to that in a minute. I just want to, before we move on to that, we mentioned keywords before. I mean, it is very difficult, I'm assuming, to pin down a certain reference. How do you decide which keyword constitutes a reference, positive or negative, to Israel, and which isn't?
Yeah, this field of research is called sentiment analysis, and there are various approaches how to classify words as positive or negative. And of course, when we are looking at bias of news, every judge has its own background, and if I would put Israeli judge, it will be different from German judge and European judge in general. You could say that what is left for an Israeli would be considered in most cases right for a European in the slant. So if a European read Haaretz, he would still find it more right-wing in general.
Yeah.
It's very interesting that the reference here is it's always comparative. It's not something
right. Okay,
but still. We try to develop, and there are many research that try to develop sentiment analysis of country names, and we try to do it by looking at. I would not get into all the process, but of course, bag of words, keywords that have a negative context in it, and a positive context in it. And we did it with several judges that are not Israeli but know the conflict very well. They are native speakers, and we looked at different European languages. We looked at German, at English, Italian, and French. And
by judges, you mean other researchers?
Other researchers, coders, we call it. And,
right.
And then we had to find an agreement between the coders and the system. When we get a certain threshold, like 80% of agreement, we find that the system is good enough to work by its own, and then we release.
Right.
Release it.
And another question about your methodology. It seems like a tremendous amount of work to sift through all those news stories and references in Google News, which is, like you said, an aggregator of so many media outlets. Do you really spend day and night going through everything, or is it? Do you also set your boundaries and say, okay, this is what we should focus on, and this is what we should leave aside?
The system actually takes all the news that published the certain day and collect the text only. It doesn't collect anything else. So we have a very large data set, but not too large in terms of computing power. But
so this is a computerized system.
Of course, everything is done by the computer.
But the judges are human, right? So
in order to prepare the system, we have to use what we call qualitative approach with a human coder, and then we teach the computer to work alone. So the coders did like several thousands of items, and the computer does several of millions of items. That's the ratio.
Right. Okay, so let's now go to the other facets of this discussion. And like we said, there's a disproportionate amount of references to Israel in the international media at large. And now, is it how do you separate between positive references and negative references, and what are your conclusions on that?
Okay, so in this particular research I did, it was a collaboration with another colleague of mine, Regula Mish, who is a linguist, and she helped me a lot to classify the keywords and teach the computer what is negative, what is positive. And we did it in a comparative analysis of various languages that mention Israel during a certain period. Of course, every period has its own context. And then we found that the British news is the most critical toward Israel. The German news is relatively less critical. And again, we can trace it back to the historical roots of...
what about the American media? Is it
the American media?
Positive?
The American media was not included in this particular research, but from other studies that were done about the sentiment of Israel, the American are the less critical among the European, if you compare it to the European countries.
And we said that it has to do with the specific historical context of the involvement and, in some cases, responsibility of these countries to the emergence of a conflict in this corner of the world.
Certainly. It's very interesting to compare the results to the public opinion surveys. The BBC conduct every year a public opinion survey, and also you could see the views of people around the world toward Israel. And if you compare the two, you would see the opposite picture. The British are the least critical, and the German are the most critical toward Israel when you look at the public opinion. So there is a mirror.
Yeah, so it's an inverse correlation. So the British media is far more critical of Israel as opposed to the British public, who are relatively uncritical of Israel. And in Germany, it's the other way around.
And maybe there is a compensation mechanism here. The German, they feel that the media is too much in constraint. They cannot say what they want in the publicly, so they would be more... They would take the more critical approach. And in the British media, it's the opposite. There is so much criticism toward Israel, and so they get to be more soft.
So the question is, and actually this defies the thumb rule in media studies at large, and that is that the media is reflective of public opinion.
To certain extent, of course, that's the theory. It says there are several theories. We call it agenda settings, that the media tells you what to think about in a certain period, and then there is also the framing, how the media frames certain issues, and it's not always such a strong effect like we tend to think. The media has some effect, of course. In the different studies that I did, I tried to look at what is the connection between our memory and the dimensions of countries in the media in different countries. And there is a very strong correlation. We remember countries that appear in the news. That's how we know about most of the country. We don't have the privilege to visit all those countries. Yet there are certain differences, and there is a space or room for our own judgment, depending on our personality and, of course, our media usage. Some people are heavy users, and then they tend to be more affected by the media, but others have more a critical view toward the media, so they have this
what's
filter.
the proportion in the population by and large? Are there more people who are heavy consumers of the media, or other people who are critical of the role of the media? Which is a bigger group?
Traditionally, the very few people are heavy consumers of media, but some of them have the role of influencer. We don't hear about the news from the media, but through them. This theory is called the two-step flow of the media. We don't hear the news directly from the media, but from like media savvies, those who are opinion leaders.
Who are often journalists. And the question is whether these people who are heavy news junkies, heavy consumers of the news, tend to become journalists and therefore set the media agenda. So it's kind of a self-perpetuating system that that in a way goes in separate direction from the general public.
Not to separate, but right. It has an effect.
No, because
of course.
Because then it explains the what you said earlier.
Yeah.
Why in Germany and the UK the reference to Israel, and that's I'm sure just one example out of many. The attitudes are the polar opposite. The attitudes in the media are the polar opposite of what they are in the general public.
Yeah, it has a certain effect, of course, but it's not absolute, and like we tend to think, it is limited.
Right. Okay, Dr. Elad Segev, thank you very much for this. This is really, really enlightening, and I encourage our listeners to go to your website and look up other studies that you've conducted. Some of them are available online. Many of them are in English, so no obstacle there. Dr. Elad Segev of the Department of Communication at the Tel Aviv University. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also, don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org. Like us on Facebook and follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.